Welcome, everyone. My name is Jennifer Houston. I'm a cattle producer and livestock auction market operator from East Tennessee and currently serve as president of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. I'm pleased to welcome you to the first of 3 webinars in our series focused on cattle reproduction. We are proud to be partnered in this series with the Repro Task Force team, beef cattle reproduction experts from universities across the country. As a participant, your line will be muted, but feel free to type in questions in the question box on your screen, and at the end of the presentation, the team will answer as many questions as time will allow. If you have trouble with your technology, or if you are joining us only for the audio, the webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing within 24 hours at ncba.org. The webinar tonight focuses on planning for heat synchronization success. Tonight's speakers are Dr. Sandy Johnson with Kansas State University and Dr. David Patterson with the University of Missouri. You can view their bios at ncba.org. With that, Dr. Patterson, I will now hand it off to you.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the invitation to participate in this evening's webinar. What I hope to do over the next 30 minutes or so is to review with you current protocols and recommendations for synchronization of estrus and ovulation and replacement heifers, 2-year-old cows, mature cows, and then close with some discussion regarding split-time artificial insemination. So those of us who have been involved over the years with work related to development of these protocols, specifically focused on fixed-time artificial insemination, have had several priorities in mind in designing these systems. First, that they be easy to schedule and administer. Second, that they reduce or minimize animal handling. And third, this final point I think is primary, in that the focus has been to develop systems that result in a highly synchronized and fertile estrus and ovulation. So I want to begin this evening's discussion with recommended protocols for heifers. And most all of you hopefully viewing this evening or tuning in this evening are aware of the recommended list of protocols for both heifers and cows. These are available through our task force website at beefrepro.info, but they're also available in the backs of all the major AI stud books or bull books. And so this evening, what I want to do to begin with is initiate the discussion with protocols related to specifically heifers. And as you'll note in looking at this list of recommended protocols, there are 2 short-term protocols and then 2 longer-term protocols. So to begin the discussion with the long-term progestin-based protocols, there's 2 options in terms of the specific progestins that you may choose from. Those would involve either melengesterol acetate or MGA, or the controlled internal drug release, which we all refer to as the CEDAR. So to begin with, for those of you that may not be familiar with or have used MGA in the past, MGA is an orally active progestin. It's administered through the feed. It should be fed once a day, about the same time every day for that feeding period. And we would recommend feeding it in a grain or supplement carrier, and in a carrier about 3 to 5 pounds. So the animals that are involved will more or less consume it at one ingestion, as opposed to having to come back and forth over the course of the day. As you can see by the illustration here in terms of the graphic, it is fed for 14 days, and then the recommended interval between withdrawal of MGA from the feed and prostaglandin administration is a period of 19 days. If you're breeding according to observed estrus, that heat detection period should occur over a period of 6 days. And that's a good point to make at this juncture, given the fact that if you are doing any estrus detection in relation to any of the protocols following the administration of prostaglandin, the actual synchronized period that cattle can respond to that injection of prostaglandin actually can occur over a period of 6 days or 144 hours. In contrast to the CEDAR is administered for a period of 14 days, so in on a Monday, out 2 weeks later on a Monday, and then you'll notice the difference in interval between CEDAR removal and prostaglandin. In this case, it's a period of 16 days. and prostaglandin would then be administered on day 30. The reason for the differences in terms of intervals between progestin withdrawal, given the two that are listed, and prostaglandin administration deals with what's illustrated on this graphic. So the top panel represents heifers that were assigned to the MGA-based protocol and their corresponding heat distribution pattern coming off of MGA, in contrast to the cedar-treated heifers. In this case, you can see there's a much more robust expression of estrus. This then correlates to the difference in timing relative to when prostaglandin is administered. But this graph then illustrates the distribution of estrus following the administration of prostaglandin for those two treatment groups. So although these bar graphs look similar for the two treatments, the black bars represent the MGA-treated heifers, the gray bars represent the cedar-treated heifers. When you run the analysis on these two profiles, basically what we look at is the variance for interval to estrus, which is essentially an indication of the degree of synchrony that more or less accompanies either of these or follows administration of either of these protocols. And what the analysis indicates is that the degree of synchrony is significantly improved. In other words, the heifers come in over a tighter time period that are assigned to the cedar protocol in comparison to the MGA-treated heifers. So if you're breeding according to fixed time insemination, as you can see illustrated here, the interval then between prostaglandin administration and fixed time AI for the MGA-treated heifers is a period of 72 hours, in which case all the heifers would be inseminated and all heifers would be administered GnRH at the time of insemination. And in the case of the cedar-treated heifers, inseminations are performed 66 hours after prostaglandin, and again, all heifers receive GnRH at the time of AI. So rather than showing you a lot of numbers, basically, if you boil the data down, looking at how the two protocols compare head-to-head when inseminations were performed on the basis of observed estrus, work that we were involved with here at the University of Missouri really found no differences in synchronized conception or pregnancy rates among heifers that were bred according to estrus. And in contrast to that, fixed time AI pregnancy rates resulting from or following administration of either of those two protocols basically showed the same. There were no differences in fixed time AI pregnancy rates, and this was work conducted at the University of Nebraska. So as we follow now with the two short-term protocols, basically the 7-day protocol is one which probably more people are familiar with. In this case, because of the shortened length of the protocol, GnRH is administered at cedar insertion. The cedar remains in for a period of 7 days. So again, in on a Monday, out the following Monday, at which time, at the time the cedar is removed, prostaglandin is administered. And in this case, timed insemination is performed at 54 hours following cedar removal and prostaglandin, and GnRH is administered coincident with insemination. The 5-day protocol is a bit more involved, similar to the 7-day protocol, in that GnRH is administered at cedar insertion. But as you'll note, as illustrated on this slide, 2 injections of prostaglandin are required. And let me take a moment to just explain the rationale or reason for that. When GnRH is administered at the time the cedar is inserted, basically if a heifer has a dominant follicle that's in the 10 millimeter size range or greater, basically what that will do is that injection of GnRH will do is turn that follicle over, and essentially what will happen then is that estrogen producing structure will convert to a progesterone producing structure, or what we refer to as an accessory corpus luteum. So given the shortened length of cedar treatment, then the initial injection of prostaglandin in most cases is not probably going to be sufficient to effectively lyse that corpus luteum to enable that heifer to actually exhibit estrus or come into estrus following cedar removal and prostaglandin. So as you can see, as illustrated here, there is a second injection of prostaglandin that is required, and then that is followed by insemination performed 60 hours following cedar removal and the first injection of prostaglandin. but also note that GnRH is again administered coincident with AI. So if you boil the data down based on comparison of these protocols, in this case, the 7-day versus the 5-day and the 14-day versus the 5-day, this is from data that's actually in the refereed or published literature. Basically, the only comparison that showed any significant or biological difference in terms of the treatment comparisons was with respect to the 5-day versus 7-day, with, as you can see here, the advantage going to heifers that were assigned to the 5-day protocol. So one of the things that we've emphasized here in Missouri with regard to work we've done with our heifer program in the state is to really work toward developing the concept that in order to obtain success with AI programs in heifers, it's probably a good idea to determine how many of your heifers are cycling and are they in fact ready to synchronize. And so with our program in Missouri, basically all heifers are required to go through a pre-breeding exam that's referred to as a reproductive TRACT score. It is a direct assessment of reproductive development. And basically, the tracts are either palpated transrectally or ultrasounded to assign a score of 1 to 5, with 1 being a prepubertal or infantile heifer, 2s and 3s indicating that the heifers are still peripubertal. But as you can see here, heifers that would be assigned a score of 2 would be considered to be greater than 30 days from reaching puberty, whereas those assigned a score of 3 would be probably within a month from attainment of puberty. Scores of 4 and 5 would indicate that the heifers are estrus cycling or have reached puberty, but at different stages of the estrus cycle. And in the case of the heifers assigned a score of 4, those heifers are in the follicular phase of the cycle. So in other words, they're either in heat or on the verge of coming into heat at the time of the exam, whereas heifers that are assigned to 5 are in the luteal phase of the cycle. So in other words, somewhere between day 6 and 16 of their cycles. So timing is a critical consideration when we're talking about these exams. So they should be performed roughly 4 to 6 weeks before breeding. And we consider groups of heifers that go on a progestin-based protocol ready to synchronize when at least half or greater of the heifers are assigned a TRACT score of 4 or 5. And one of the things that I think is interesting about the timing of these, not only from the standpoint of the heifers themselves and performing those exams at an optimum time or a preferred time relative to the start of the breeding season. But the other thing that we're finding is that they very effectively can coincide with the start of one of the long-term progestin-based protocols. And so what's occurring in herds across the state here in Missouri is the fact that our veterinary practitioners across the state are getting very much more involved with pre-breeding evaluations or reproductive management in general on herds across the state. And so when the pre-breeding exams are performed, basically it's more or less a one-stop shop. So in many cases now, pre-breeding booster vaccinations are administered at the time the TRACT scores are assigned or the reproductive evaluations are performed. And what you can see here is that more or less initiates the beginning of the synchronization protocol. So let me take a moment and show you or share with you some data from our heifer program. We have a centralized database which allows us to track performance of heifers that go on some of these synchronization programs. And in this case, what I'm showing is summary data involving close to 40,000 heifers that were all appointment bred. And what's shown on this slide are the timed AI pregnancy rates based on the TRACT scores that were assigned to heifers at the time the exams were performed. And so what you can see here is that there's a very distinct increase in pregnancy outcome among those heifers that were appointment bred based on the reproductive TRACT score that they were assigned at the time the exams were done. And so essentially in our program now, most of the heifers that are assigned a score of 1, and in many cases, those heifers that are assigned a score of 2 are actually being culled before the breeding season and either moved to a feed yard or to a sale barn, because the breeding performance of those heifers in time programs, and in many cases, the breeding season in general is not what we would consider to be ideal. When we break the data down further and eliminate those heifers that were assigned a TRACT score 1 and group the non-cycling heifers In other words, the 2s and 3s together, and then the 4s and 5s classified as cycling. What you can see on this slide is a breakdown of how the heifers performed based on cyclicity status at the time treatments were initiated, or rather at the times the reproductive exams were performed. Among those that were assigned to the 7-day co-sync plus CEDAR protocol, either MGA prostaglandin or the 14-day CEDAR. And you can take a moment to look at the differences relative to cycling status of the heifers, but basically when it comes right down to it, any group of heifers that any of you that are using these protocols will be dealing with is what the overall percentage is or was. And what you can see here, among about 2,000 heifers on the 7-day co-sync CEDAR protocol, 40% timed AI preg rate, about 800 on MGA prostaglandin, 44% of those conceived to timed insemination, and the highest pregnancy rate was observed among heifers on the 14-day CEDAR, with a little over 37,000 heifers assigned to this protocol. And what you can see from this slide is by far and away, we're seeing the greatest use of that protocol to set heifers up for fixed time artificial insemination in our program here in the state. So some take-home points for heifers: the protocols do work. However, I would caution you that choosing a protocol for timed AI and heifers should should involve careful consideration of the pre-treatment cyclicity status of heifers, and I am a firm believer in doing these pre-breeding exams. The other thing that I would mention is that despite some of the differences or lack thereof relative to some of the treatment comparisons, I think anytime you're working with very large mixed groups of heifers based on cycling status, I think in general the long-term protocols organize estrus cycles of those heifers that are induced in comparison to those heifers that were estrus cycling at the time they went on treatment, to perform more similarly once the inseminations are actually performed during the synchronized period. The final point relative to the heifers then is that protocol compliance will determine success, and that's going to be determined in large measure by product administration and compliance. So what about 2-year-olds? How do the short versus the long-term CEDAR-based protocols compare? And we actually designed a trial several years ago to evaluate this question. And so what you can see on this slide, we compared the 14-day CEDAR, in which case the 2-year-olds were inseminated at 72 hours. This was compared to the 7-day co-sync CEDAR treated heifers, which were inseminated at 66 hours. This was done at 3 locations, 2 large operations in Southwest Montana and 1 here in Missouri. And if you look at the initial estrus response data, in which case we were able to put estrotech patches on these 2-year-olds at the time prostaglandin was administered, we see differences relative to estrus expression, which is very comparable to what we've seen in the past among the females that are placed on the long-term protocol when we're considering cows in relation to in comparison to heifers. But you do see a significant improvement in terms of the total heat response up to the point of timed AI among the 7-day treated cows. When we look at then pregnancy rates resulting from timed AI, despite the differences between groups relative to estrus expression, no difference in fixed time AI pregnancy rates, excellent pregnancy rates to timed insemination, comparable pregnancy rates within the first 30 days of the breeding season, and excellent pregnancy rates then at the end of the breeding season. So basically, to try and explain that data, essentially what we saw is that there were slight differences relative to follicle diameters among those heifers or 2-year-olds that were assigned to each of the 2 treatments, with the larger size follicles among the 7-day treated cows. However, what really I think explains the differences or comparable lack of differences, I should say, relative to pregnancy outcome is the fact that the estradiol concentrations on those longer-term treated cows were actually 2-fold higher, which really helps to explain the fertility similarities between the 2 groups. So in our hands, the 2 protocols work very effectively in those younger age females, and I think a large part of the benefit comes from the progestin itself in terms of, again, organizing estrus cycles of those that or cycling or perhaps induced coming off the treatment. So I want to move quickly now into discussion of cows, and basically one of the things we are challenged with is the overall concept of Estrus. And this is a typical progesterone profile of most all cows. In fact, some of the data would indicate that 90% of cows, as they return to cycling status following calving, will exhibit what's shown on this profile. This is a progesterone profile showing progesterone concentrations that are elevated, and you can see this short rise in progesterone is illustrated here, followed by more or less a normal cycle length. And this is essentially what occurs in the majority of cows as they return to cycling status following calving. We can mimic that short rise by either one of the two tools that is illustrated in this slide, by administering GnRH with the idea here that if the cow has a follicle again in that 10 millimeter or greater size range, we can turn that follicle over and create the formation of an accessory CL, which will secrete progesterone, or perhaps more effectively would be insertion of the seeder for that short duration, which essentially mimics that short rise that you see there. So we pulled data from a number of published studies from students in my graduate students in my program, in which case we pulled blood samples 2 times prior to the time treatments were initiated. And this slide represents over 3,000 cows that were assigned to timed AI programs. And based on the progesterone profiles of those cows on either one of the 2 sampling times, what we found was at the time treatments were initiated, 54% of the cows were cycling and 46% of those cows were in estrus. But what you can see here is that there's really no difference in terms of the pregnancy rates between the 2 resulting from timed AI. So the take-home message here is that these protocols work very effectively to really support overall reproductive management of these herds. So I want to talk now specifically about the 7-day and the 5-day coasting protocols. And we, along with the group at Virginia Tech, did a head-to-head comparison of the 2 protocols. In the 5-day protocol, similar to what we talked about in the heifers, you can see here that the timing of insemination for the cows is recommended to be at 72 hours. And in the case of the cows that were assigned to the 7-day protocol, the comparison was made at 66 hours. When we look at the pregnancy rates after timed AI, the work here in Missouri, we found identical pregnancy rates between that resulted following fixed time AI, following administration of either of the 2 protocols. The work from Virginia Tech showed a 3 percentage point advantage to the 5-day protocol, but note that those cows in the 7-day treated group were actually inseminated at 69 hours. So despite that fact, one of the points that I want to go back and highlight is what happened as a result of cycling status of those cows at the time treatments were initiated. If we look at the cows that were here in Missouri on trial, and based on the blood sampling of those cows, 70% of the estrus cycling cows assigned to the 5-day protocol became pregnant to timed AI versus 64% of the 7-day treated cows. And when we look at the cows that were designated as being anestrus based on progesterone samples prior to the time treatments were initiated, we find that 63% of the 5-day treated cows versus 70% of the 7-day treated cows became pregnant. So although these differences or these numbers or percentages are numerically different, there's no statistical difference. But again, the take-home message here is that there's an opportunity to successfully manage those mixed groups of females. We conducted a series of extensive field demonstrations here in Missouri with 73 herds and over 7,000 cows using the 7-day coasting plus feeder protocol, and reported a 62% timed AI pregnancy rate on those cows. And Sandy Johnson, in comparison to the field trials that we ran here in Missouri, pulled all the published literature and reported a 62% timed AI, a timed AI pregnancy rate for over 2,000 cows. So essentially, I think either of these protocols work very effectively, and I think it's a matter of preference and management considerations that will make the decision as to which ones to use. Some points that I want to make relative to does timing matter, and we did a comparison or ran a comparison several years ago to look at 54 versus 60-hour time points in terms of fixed time AI. And basically, this involved about a little over 800 cows with over 400 per treatment. The time to AI preg rates were exceptionally good for both treatment groups, 61% for the 54-hour treated cows versus 67% for the 66-hour treated cows. But there was a statistical advantage and improvement among cows that were inseminated at 66 hours. If we look at when we actually inseminated those cows in relation to when we said they would, all the cows are actually, the timing of prostaglandin injection is recorded, and then we then also follow with the exact time those cows were inseminated. And you can see the mean times of insemination for the cows in each treatment were very close to when we projected that they would occur. One interesting point is that we actually used heat watch at one of the locations to actually record estrus response up to the point of time to AI. And what you can see from this slide is that clearly there's more cows that exhibit estrus up to the point of 66 hours versus those that were inseminated earlier. What's important from this is, and this emphasizes why timing matters, is that despite the fact those cows in the 54-hour group that did show estrus had exceptionally good pregnancy rates at 65%, look at how high the pregnancy rates were among the cows that exhibited estrus that were inseminated at 66 hours. And among those cows that did not exhibit estrus in either treatment, you can see comparable pregnancy rates. So in summary, I think I've used these slides to emphasize the importance of timing and paying attention to the recommendations that are listed on those sheets. So some quick take-home points with regard to the cow considerations. Choosing a protocol for time AI in cows should consider the age of the female, the number of days postpartum, and body condition. And again, protocol compliance will determine success both in terms of product administration and timing of insemination. The one other point that I want to make with regard to synchronization programs for both heifers and cows is the topic of estradiol. And I think in general, the recommendation based on FDA considerations is that the estradiol products are not legally available for synchronization in the United States. And the FDA has warned veterinarians and pharmacies against compounding estradiol products for use in food animals. So I want to conclude very quickly with the concept of split time AI. And this is a modified approach to fixed time insemination. And the question was raised initially that led to this is based on what's listed here in this slide. And that is it feasible to optimize male and female fertility by better aligning the time at which AI is performed with when ovulation is expected to occur based on estrus expression, and then use estrus expression to determine whether and when to administer GnRH. So in pretty much all the trials now that we run, either in organized research trials or field demonstrations, we put Estrotech patches on cows at the time prostaglandin is administered, and we consider a patch to be activated when at least half or more of the patch is rubbed off, as you can see is illustrated on this slide. So the work that was initially done, basically what we did, and this boils right down to the recommendations that our group has really, some of the work that we've done here has resulted in. Among heifers, on the 14-day cedar, we administer Estrotech at the time prostaglandin is administered at 66 hours, and as is the case on the cows on the lower slide, all the estrus heifers at 66 hours and corresponding with the cows at 66 hours, all those females are inseminated. And based on the fact that they have exhibited estrus, there's no advantage or need to administer GnRH at the time inseminations are performed. And then those females that fail to exhibit estrus up to the point of 66 hours in either case, those are held over for 24 hours, both in the case of heifers and cows. And only those females that remain non-estrus based on their Estrotech patches are administered GnRH. But at that time, all females, as illustrated here, are inseminated. So we've done 2 other trials more recently with MGA prostaglandin and the 7-day co-sync cedar. What you can see when we compare fixed time AI to split time AI, looking at estrus response up to the point of insemination, there's clearly an increase in estrus response when we use split time AI. That resulted in a significant improvement in pregnancy rate resulting from fixed time AI. But in the case of the 7-day coasting cedar-treated heifers, although we see an increase in estrus response as seen here, 47 versus 74%, there was no corresponding increase in pregnancy rate that resulted from timed AI. So I think just to move along more quickly here and conclude, in heifers, the question has to be asked, did split time AI result in an increase in both estrus response and pregnancy rate resulting from fixed time AI? And as I showed earlier, it did increase estrus response in both the long-term treated heifer groups relative to the 14-day cedar and MJ prostaglandin. This was accompanied by an increase in pregnancy rate resulting from fixed time AI. However, in the case of the 7-day coasting cedar-treated heifers, although we saw an increase in estrus response, that was not associated with an increase in pregnancy rate resulting from fixed time AI. So our current recommendation relative to the use of split time is illustrated on this graphic. So in heifers, we would, if producers are in a position to actually utilize split time artificial insemination, the data would indicate that it would make sense in terms of increasing both estrus response and timed AI pregnancy rates with both the 14-day cedar and the MJ prostaglandin treatment in heifers. And in cows, we've seen an improvement as a result of treatment in conjunction with the 7-day coasting cedar-treated females. So real quickly, where do we go from here? Where the industry, I think, will need to have support in going forward. I think we're going to need to work on continued development of protocols to utilize timed AI or split time AI in Bos indicus influenced females. And then I think in addition to that, there's going to need to be further work in terms of developing breeding strategies that will expand use of sex-sorted semen in conjunction with either fixed time AI or split time AI. So with that, I'll move quickly through some acknowledgements just for all the various supporters of the work that we've done over the years. And at this point, I think I'll turn it back to Sandy Johnson.
Good evening. I think I've got my screen up. I'm happy to be invited to share some things with you this evening. And what we want to do is really look at implementing some of the things that Dave talked about. Now, however, if you don't have a problem, say, missing birthdays or anniversaries, or you've never miscounted quantities of anything, or never picked up the wrong thing off the counter, you know, you just as well hang up. This isn't for you. But if by chance that occasionally you've had some challenges with timing and perhaps like these dinosaurs find yourself missing some key date, then I think some of the tools that I have to share with you will help you keep reproductive programs on schedule and as well help you communicate with, hopefully you have a team to help implement some of these things. So if we think about our year-round production schedule for cows, we're fixed by that 365-day calendar and our gestation length of the cow, leaving us about 82 days in the remainder of the year to get that cow rebred in a timely fashion. Now, we can't really shorten gestation length to any practical extent, so it's really, if our nutritional management isn't timely, that postpartum interval can really extend. So our reproductive success then comes down to timing. We have to deal with the physiology of the animal and the timing that's there. And so not only do we have this from a year-round aspect, but as Dave mentioned, the importance of timeliness when we look at applying these synchronization protocols. So I'm going to talk about several tools, the first of which is called the Management Minder to help with year-round planning. And then the second tool will be the Estrus Synchronization Planner. And we have a couple different versions of that to meet various needs. So when I think about this year-round production schedule, if I were to ask any of you here this evening, you could very quickly tell me when your calving season starts or when your breeding season starts. But if I ask you when the start of the third trimester was, you'd probably have to take a few moments to back calculate that. And I would argue that that start of the third trimester is the most underappreciated day in the life of a cow, and that really that is the key to our reproductive success, particularly in a spring calving herd, and the need for that animal to have adequate body condition at the time of calving. So really that was a key driver in the development of the management minder, and it's essentially a web-based program to help you keep track of your program, your production system year-round. So think of it as your own personal assistant. And based on the key management decisions in your herd, so that the start of your breeding season or the start of your calving season, when you turn out to grass or when you wean, it incorporates notices or tasks on a calendar based on a default interval from those key management dates. For example, if we're going to get our calving supplies ready, really that's going to be some period of time prior to the start of calving, which is back calculated from the start of breeding. If we think about grass turnout and we want to start a high mag mineral before that, again, we can suggest an interval prior to grass turnout when you should start feeding that high mag mineral. Same way thinking about weaning. Are you going to, you may precondition those calves with some vaccinations pre-weaning, or whether you start the day of weaning, you have supplies to obtain and things to get ready. So again, those recommendations are set up based on those key decisions you have in your production system. And there's also a category that's general that might include things that are not strictly timed, but most of it is related to, again, the timing of key things in your operation. So what does this do then? It essentially allows you to create an electronic calendar that sends you reminders, such as we see here. You see I'm getting a reminder for veterinary feed directive meeting, either on my phone or on my computer, and I can snooze that or cancel that notification as I choose. So it helps keeps those things in front of you and not let dates slip up on you. You can look at it on a calendar such as this, working with planning your month or week with your team, help see what needs to be going on. None of this is rocket science. It's just trying to help keep those important dates on the calendar and out ahead of you. This is just looking at some of the activities in a different form, and of course you could look at them like this as well. You'll see that I want to emphasize body condition scoring, checking replacement heifer development, planning your AI program, making sure we have bulls tested. Those are all types of things that you can include on a calendar or not. Maybe that you want to set up your health program on here, discuss it with your veterinarian, and make adjustments as needed, and maybe even schedule some dates with them. As a veterinarian, you could do the similar thing to set up what you would propose for that health program for your producers. So a good communication tool to work with other team members. So this is the opening page of the management minder, and you can see that link there from our ksubeef.org site. This is a joint effort with Iowa State University. Garland Dahlke has worked with me on a number of these projects, as with this one. To use the management minder, the first time you're going to register. That's down here at the bottom portion of the screen. and you create an account. The reason you want to do that is so that you can save the calendar you made one year and roll it over to the next year and hopefully minimize any additional work you would need to do. There's a user guide that is available, also linked here from the front page, and if you want to see all the things you can choose, those are listed in the appendix. Once you've registered, then you come back to this login page. Fairly self-explanatory to use, but again, the user guide would step you through that. All right, I want to move now to talk more about the breeding season and estrus synchronization. And Dave illustrated these protocols to you. Do note that they are dated on the top, and look for our 2019 versions of things. And so what we want to be able to do is translate what you see there onto a calendar that we can communicate, make sure everybody's on the same page, and that we know what days we're doing things. You get the Estrus Synchronization Planner from the Iowa Beef Center. You can Google Sync Planner. It's linked from our beefrepro.info site, and here is the direct link to the Iowa Beef Center. I will bring these links up again at the end to make them available for you, but beefrepro.info will get you to all of them. This is the page where you would download from the Iowa Beef Center. Notice that version 19 is the current one out there. You register to download this so that when we make significant changes, we can notify you of those changes to download another copy. If you've used it before and haven't downloaded a new copy recently, we would certainly encourage you to get the latest copy. We find little bugs here and there that we have gradually corrected and worked out. You see a video on using the Sync Planner down here at the bottom of the screen. I'll just familiarize you with some of the basics of this. We go to the Planner Worksheet tab down here at the bottom. You do need a little knowledge of Excel to use this, but if you open it up, look for that tab. What you're going to do is come in and essentially edit the values that are in this circle here by answering these questions, edit to fit your situation. And then what you can do is go to the calendar tab next and see, does that schedule fit your situation? Here we've got a cedar going in on the Sunday. Maybe Sunday is grandma's birthday. That's not going to work. Mom says we can't work cattle that day. Need to make changes. Or whoever's helping us breeding might not be available on the time of fixed time AI. So those are important things in the whole planning. We got to have our whole team there to make it work, and we all need to be on the same page. Now let's look at this inputs just a little more closely. You see the breed types, 1 or 2 for Bos indicus or Bos taurus. We look at 3 different types of synchronization systems, either all heat detection or strictly fixed timed AI, or a combination thereof. You insert that number and select a synchronization protocol from the list down below. And as you can see in this slide, we have selected fixed timed AI, but our synchronization protocol number is 6, which is not a choice with fixed timed AI. So you just get this warning there, and you'll want to use a system that matches the type of heat detection that you want. Now, many of the cells have little hints here, and a key one to look at and a key input in this area is the day to start breeding. Now, if you're using fixed timed AI, that's the day you start the fixed timed AI. Or if there's heat detection involved, that's the first day that you would start heat detection. When we input the date we want to start breeding, we can look over to the right-hand side and see the expected calving date. We can also see then the time to inject prostaglandin. And very important for these 6-timed AI systems to make sure that you're inseminating between that target window. There's usually a time plus or minus so many hours. And what you don't want to do is set up a system and find that you're supposed to be either inseminating or giving prostaglandin in the middle of the night. And I have had those calls, and that's always a little disappointing for those people when you give them the answer they don't necessarily want to hear, depending on what they did. So that's easy to check how you set up your timing. And then we want you to not try and synchronize any more animals that you can work in a 3 to 4 hour period. So the cautions that we have in this area, it asks you how many heads you can inseminate per hour and the total group size. And if you have essentially more animals than you can inseminate in 3 hours based on your estimates, you'll get a warning. And that's just being warning on the conservative side. You can do some cost comparisons with different systems by entering those system numbers here. When we come back then and look at the calendar that we generate from a particular protocol, this is probably the page people like the best, the calendar page. It shows the system. You can also indicate what product you're using. One of the common problems we have is people getting the prostaglandin product and their GnRH product confused, giving the wrong one on the wrong day. We've tried to reduce that error rate by including those names both up here as well as in the calendar. Here's your start of breeding. You can indicate a bull cleanup date and the start of calving. Again, the timing of these events, all to try and make sure it happens on the right day and the right time. No confusion among the team. You can include some additional costs down on further down on the planner worksheet page and compare cost further below. So all good options if you want to explore various costs further. If you're an AI technician, it allows you to add some additional cost and outline some services. Now we do have a mobile version. It's found at the website shown here. You do have to have a web connection to do this. It is not an app that you download. The idea being that we want to be able to keep it up to date all the time. And we're concerned if it was a download app, we wouldn't have the ability to keep it up to date. So you go through the same basic steps here in terms of selecting breed type, cow or heifer, how many you're going to do, the dates. Everything is very similar to the spreadsheet-based version. When we get to the final page, it illustrates the costs based on the inputs you have. You can email those results to yourself, and they will be in a list form like what is shown on the bottom portion of this screen rather than a calendar. I like to think of using this to kind of help set up, maybe we had our initial discussion on what day we were going to do something, and it's not as robust as the full spreadsheet version, but can be very useful in the field and to use it on the phone that way. Now, most recently, we have created what we call the multi-group edition, and that came out last fall. And the idea for that is that many of you are breeding heifers and cows, maybe multiple groups of cows or multiple groups of heifers, and it would be nice to have those all on the same calendar. And so our multi-group edition is for our more those with more use of estrus synchronization and AI. And there's a little more programming with it. You do need to enable some options in Excel as shown in these instructions. And we have a short video that just steps you through that and really recommend that for first-time users. You download it from the same site as the regular Sync Planner. It's further down on that same page. So you just roll down further. Again, you register and download that copy. All of these things are free of charge, things that we have worked to provide industry support to provide to you. So this is the working page of this multi-group planner. You'll notice it initially looks very similar to the other, but the difference comes up here. And what we do essentially is when we're creating a new set of plans, you think of that as creating a new producer. If you're just doing this for yourself rather than a new producer, it might be 2018 and 2019. But that is a first step to create the new producer. That essentially creates a folder with the synchronization programs that you've outlined, and that is saved on your computer. So we have just 2 additional inputs then. On this version, we're going to identify the breeding group, and we're going to put a name here that we want to see on our calendar to help distinguish one group from the next. We also indicate how many animals we have here, because we have also with this version the ability to summarize all the product that might be needed for a given time period. So then we have the same breed type, system, synchronization protocol number, timing, and so on. This also adds, if you want to add an early pregnancy check date, we have a date that represents, this is 30 days roughly from fixed timed AI, so that would be about the earliest you could possibly do it. Not necessarily meaning this is the date you should, but it gives you, don't try and schedule it before that. So you develop this plan, you save it, then create the plan for the next group, however many groups that you may have. When you go to the calendar page, then you see here I have 2 different groups of heifers, my heifers in red and those that I've indicated crossbred heifers, what time and what happens for each group of heifers. I can change the text color and font size or add additional text in this calendar, which are not options with the original version. So that's nice to have that option. You can put at least 12 groups of animals over a 12-month period in this multi-group edition. It also has its supply list page, and so we see our 2 groups of heifers here. It tells us then how many doses we need of the products we indicated and would summarize those. We could also look at additional supplies that we will need and have that all totaled in one place. Additional items, semen, could be listed down here below. So trying to help summarize all those things and kind of keep track of some of these larger projects. So with that kind of highlights those different tools. I want to take a moment to share with you a meeting that our Beef Reproductive Task Force hosts at various locations around the country. This year, it's going to be in Knoxville, Tennessee, August 20th to 21st. Justin Reinhardt is the key contact there in Tennessee. There'll be a day and a half or more of seminars. You'll hear from a whole range of reproductive topics. I mean, what better than to spend 2 days talking strictly about reproduction? I don't know how you could think about not being there. Part of it will be some hands-on lab type of things. We'll have graduate students there with their latest research, and we have good support from the industry, and they often have very interesting things to share that they're working on as well. So again, that's August 20th to 21st in Knoxville. And so as I summarize here, I want to give you an opportunity to jot down any of these web links there. This beefrepro.info might be the simplest to remember. We've talked about the Management Minder, which is a web-based tool that allows you to keep track of your year-round production schedule. Then we have the Estrus Synchronization Planner in various forms that makes sure you get the right product on the right day and the right timing interval so that you have success with your Estrus synchronization program. So either in the Excel versions or the mobile versions, you see those links. The AppliedReproStrategies.com website has a whole host of material from our previous Applied Reproductive Strategies meetings, as well as information on the one coming up. So just a wealth of information there in the newsroom from previous meetings. As you're working with any of these software programs that I've outlined, Garland is the tech genius, and I'm the one that would be better suited for physiology type questions, but either way, we want to help you use these tools to your advantage. That brings me to the end of the things that I have to share with you this evening, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity and turn it back over to Jennifer.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Patterson. That's been a really informative session tonight. I do want to add my invitation to visit UT for that reproductive session in August. I hope I'm going to be in Tennessee to be able to see it. I'm excited for the rest of this series and truly appreciate the collaboration and the expertise provided by the Repro Task Force team. As we move into our question and answer session, I want to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded along with all of our past webinars, and they're all available for viewing. Just click the Producer Education tab at www.ncba.org, and you'll see the Cattlemen's Webinar Series options listed. You can also register for the next webinar in our series, The Cycle of Reproduction, scheduled for April 18th at 7 p.m. Central. But before that time, we have a legislative conference coming up in Washington, D.C., April 2nd through the 4th. I hope some of y'all will be able to join us. We have a lot of freshmen members of Congress just elected that really need to understand more about the cattle industry. So again, at www.ncba.org, click on events, and you can find information about the legislative conference April 2nd through the 4th. Now let's get to your questions. Thank you again for participating in the webinar tonight. Jesse, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jesse Fulton. I am the Director of Producer Education here at NCBA. I'd like to remind you to please chat in your questions in the chat box. I will moderate those to our speakers, and while you are entering your questions, I'd like to encourage you to please complete the survey that you receive after this webinar. We use that information in planning all of our future webinars. So let's get on to your questions. Previously, I had a question emailed to me concerning Bos indicus, and so I am actually going to hand it back over to Dr. Dave Patterson, who is going to chat with us a little bit about sync protocols for Bos indicus cattle. Dave?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Jesse. That question, I think, is an important one, and if you remember how I concluded my slides in terms of what future research I think needs to be conducted, in anticipation of that question, I included a couple slides here at the end. If you have a chance to refer to our protocol sheets, currently there is only one protocol that is recommended by the task force and our leadership team and that's for Bos indicus cows or Bos indicus influenced cows only. And it's more complicated or more involved, I should say, perhaps than some of the other protocols that I spoke about that have been more or less evaluated in Bos taurus females, exclusively. But the work that Gary Williams' group at Texas A&M have published is illustrated here, and again, it's with respect primarily to cows. But what you can see in terms of how that protocol is designed, you'll recall that with the 5-day protocol, GnRH is administered at CEDAR insertion. But what you see in addition to the beginning of this protocol is also a corresponding or a ejection of prostaglandin at the time GnRH is administered. The reason for that is that among cycling cows that then have the CEDAR inserted, Bos indicus influenced females are much more sensitive to progesterone than are Bos taurus females. And so by administering prostaglandin at CEDAR insertion and reducing theoretically what concentrations of progesterone those females are seeing, if in fact they are cyclic, that's in large measure the rationale for it. What you can see here in addition is that that's then followed at the time CEDARs are removed by 2 injections of prostaglandin, but you'll also note that the timing of insemination in comparison to the cows is altered. And so that's one important consideration for you to be aware of. We currently have no protocols that are recommended for Bos indicus influenced heifers. We have, however, our group here at Mizzou and in collaboration with the University of Florida have conducted 2 relatively large field trials with Bos indicus influenced heifers. This was in collaboration with the University of Florida, Florida Cattlemen's Association, and the Deseret Ranches. These 2 experiments involved a little over 2,000 females. And very quickly, you can see the 4 protocols that were evaluated were the 2 long-term protocols, MGA and prostaglandin, and the 14-day CEDAR prostaglandin, and 2 were involved natural service exposure, in which case you can see after the CEDAR and MGA treatment, there was a period of waiting of 10 days, in which case then bulls were exposed to those synchronized groups of females. And in the case of the timed AI groups, they were then inseminated based on the schedules that we previously discussed. One thing that I want to highlight here is that if you look at the total pregnancy rates among the non-natural service versus the timed AI groups in terms of total pregnancy rates that are shown, you can see those listed at the bottom. But if we begin with the heifers that were, all these heifers were TRACT scored, as I talked about previously. Basically, what you can see is that actually the group that performed better were those heifers that were in the natural service treated groups as compared to the time-bred heifers. But what you can see here among the heifers that were actually cyclic, those heifers that, regardless of whether they were on the CEDAR or MGA-based treatment, that were time-bred, they performed very similarly to what we see in comparison to cyclic heifers that are Bos taurus females. In other words, no Bos indicus, and more or less the peripubral heifers were intermediate. So, in our hands right now, and I think you'll be seeing some follow-up work with regard to this. I think the longer-term progestin-based protocols, based on the work that we've done to date, seem to be working pretty effectively in heifers, but again, that's going to be highly influenced by cyclicity status. So I hope that answers the question.
All right, thank you, Dr. Patterson. So now jumping over to the rest of our questions. Can you place a CEDAR into a heifer that's standing heat? This individual doesn't want her heifer to calve 10 days ahead of the rest of the heifers when they come in heat. And this, whoever wants to take that question.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, so they were just asking about placing a CEDAR into a heifer that is actually already in standing heat. So I take it that probably that the heifer is already standing in heat. However, they don't have the rest of their heifers synced up with her, and they don't want that heifer calving 10 days earlier than the rest. What would you suggest they do?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd jump in and respond. Depending upon the protocol, I don't think there's any, there shouldn't be any problem with that at all. If you're using the 7-day co-sync cedar protocol, that heifer, if she already is in heat, she's programmed to ovulate. And so, the 7-day protocol will work effectively in terms of starting her with the rest of the group. And in the case of the 14-day cedar, the same would apply. So, whatever protocol rather that the individual is interested in using, there shouldn't be a problem, because in any group of cycling heifers that you administer treatments to, there's a pretty good likelihood that the day the treatments begin, that something or someone will be in estrus. So that's those things are considerations are taken into account based on how the protocols are designed.
Great. The other thing I would just mention is that even if we breed them all on one day, there will be some, they're going to calve over 3 to even 4 weeks. So please be prepared for a range of calving dates, not just 2 to 3 days.
Yes, not all of them read the book, do they? All right. How can you tell the difference between a TRACT score of a 2 and a 3 via palpation?
Oh, there's a pretty obvious difference. And that's based on uterine horn diameter and then also palpable structures on the ovary, specifically in that case follicles and size of follicles. So in the literally thousands that we've done, those various scores, they make a lot of sense once you actually start going through sets of heifers. And I think one of the important points to make, and I apologize if it seemed as though I had to rush through the talk, but there's so much to cover in that amount of time. But one of the important consideration related to the TRACT scores, and I think this refers in many cases to heifers that are being purchased to develop and then breed. One of the important things I think to ask, or one of the important questions to ask, is whether or not heifers have been implanted during the suckling phase. And we ran into this a number of years ago in heifers that had been implanted during the suckling phase, that when we went in to do the exams from a phenotypic standpoint, as far as weight of the heifers, development status of the heifers, age, those points, the heifers looked exceptionally good and ready to go. But then when we got in and actually evaluated those heifers based on the pre-breeding exams, the effects of the implants were pretty obvious and they're palpable. What those implants will do is they'll actually permanently disrupt glandular development in the uterus. But that aside, once you start going through sets of heifers at the appropriate time relative to when the breeding season begins, those scores will really help you assess the development status of those heifers. But it'll also help you point out how good a job you did in terms of selecting heifers to retain as replacement.
All right. How long should we wait after postpartum or after calving before we try to start syncing up our cows?
Sandy, you want to start with that one?
Sure. Part of, I guess there's 2 ways to approach that. If I'm selecting individual cows to go into a synchronization program, probably the minimum number of days I would want them to be at the time that we did AI would be 45 days. If we look at our response to, or how many are cycling and subsequent response to synchronization and fertility there, we have an increased number of animals cycling as we have more animals that have more time between calving and the start of our breeding season. And one of the advantages to a synchronization program, as you start that, you begin to get more and more animals calving early. depending on what your starting calving distribution was. So over time, you have more animals with a longer postpartum interval at the start of your breeding season to get a slightly higher response. So what you're able to do over time is actually shorten that total breeding season if you want, or selectively keep those cows that conceive early to get a better response. And so again, whether you're selecting individuals to go into a synchronization program or the whole group, you can think about that 45 days as kind of a minimum. The other part of that might be what type of protocol that you're going to start them on. Would not want to put a CEDAR in a cow that was any less than, say, 3 weeks post-calving, but we can get some of those pregnant that are relatively short postpartum, and it's a great advantage to be able to move those up. So if I'm looking at doing a large group, I'm certainly not afraid of doing some of those cows that are shorter postpartum, as long as they have adequate body condition. So we would consider days postpartum, body condition, as well as age. A thin young cow is a poor risk in terms of responding, and so we need to give her a little longer postpartum and be in a little better body condition before we might get as good of response as we would with a mature cow in excellent body condition. What did I miss, Dave?
I think you covered it. The only thing that I would add is that, you know, Sandy mentioned that the earliest you could probably consider, you know, using CEDARs post-calving would be about 21 days. You know, we all get that question a lot, and I think just from a purely reproductive management standpoint, one of the big benefits which she highlighted, and I think some of that data that I showed with regard to cycling status of cows, again, if they're in adequate body condition, one of the big advantages is the jump start that you realize from use of these progestins. And so whether that cow conceives to that, you know, that really early treatment or not, I think in our experience, what we've seen is you will advance conception date on those cows. You have to understand that the uterus doesn't really involute and get back into breeding shape until about 40 to 45 days post-calving, but that induction response that you see coming off the CEDAR will undoubtedly set those cows up to, in all likelihood, conceive earlier, whether they are able to conceive to that insemination or not. So I think if you've got a mixed group of cows, and again, you've got some cows that you're trying to catch up, I think it's a really good consideration in terms of just reproductive management in general.
And remember, you don't have to use this same dollar value of semen on this late calving cow that you might on, you know, your cow that's in more ideal condition.
All right. Can 1 2-year-old bull handle, let's say we have 55 cows, we do a timed AI, 60% take on the timed AI protocol, and cover a 60-day breeding season if we just have 1 2-year-old bull to cover the other 40%?
Okay, I jump in real quick. I think the first thing is I think producers need to be sure that they're doing breeding soundness exams on those bulls and make sure that, you know, they're passing adequately with regard to those exams. You know, if say you do have the 55 cows and you get a 60% pregnancy rate to timed AI, I think 1 2-year-old bull could adequately handle those cows. One of the considerations that you need to be aware of is that you know, those cows are still going to be somewhat synchronized. They will start spreading out among those cows that fail to conceive to AI that return to estrus. during that subsequent estrus or time frame. But one thing that I always caution producers, if they have single sires going into into cleanup groups like that, is to try and pay attention during that first repeat time. And if you have mixed groups of females, 2-year-olds on up to mature age cows, those cycle lengths from that induced or from that synchronized or timed insemination time point, those returns theoretically based on cycle lengths could occur over a period of days, anywhere from 17 to 24 days following that timed insemination. So, and added to that, some of those will actually spread out perhaps a bit longer. So the best advice would be to, on that first repeat in particular, pay attention to those groups and see that, number one, you don't have a huge group returning, but more importantly, pay attention to what that bull's getting done. And if it looks like he's getting overworked, and that could be the case if you did not have good success with your timed AI program. It's always good to have a backup in waiting if necessary, if a bull goes down or something unforeseen were to happen. But especially on that first repeat, I would definitely advise paying attention to how that bull's getting things covered. Sandy, you might have other comments.
Yeah, we didn't, it wasn't indicated whether or not this 2-year-old had a yearling breeding season. I certainly would not want, even if he was a 2-year-old, if this was his first breeding season, would not want to necessarily put him in that alone. It would be higher risk. And, we have to recognize whenever we're using a single bull, we have higher risk. Our breeding soundness exam does not evaluate libido. With the right bull, you could put that one bull with 100 cows after AI, and he probably would get the job done, but we haven't figured out how to identify that right bull.
All right. Dr. Patterson, bouncing back to the Bos indicus protocols, what about if we have a cross? Half Bos indicus, half Bos taurus? What protocol would work?
Well, I think, the work that Gary Williams did and the protocol that's listed on the protocol sheets for cows, those were not full bloods. Those were Bos indicus influence. The percentage indicus on those in the work that Gary did, I'm not entirely sure if they were half bloods or what the percentage was. The work that we've been involved with, and then I would say too, I was on the faculty at the University of Kentucky for 8 years before coming to Mizzou, and we developed a Brangus herd there. And again, I would go back to the point that I do think these longer term protocols in heifers, because we saw that also with the Brangus heifers at UK. But the work that we've done with Deseret, with the large groups of heifers in Florida, those heifers were up to 3/8 indicus. And so we have not, as a group, done any work with full bloods. But again, I'd go back to the point that I just think that's one of the areas that in particular really need some attention, because when you consider that 25 to 30% of the total U.S. cow herd resides in the Gulf Coast states, there's a real lack of research that pertains to the products that we have available for use in the United States to successfully synchronize these cows. And so I think that's one area that over the next several years, I hope gets some attention from the research community in those states. But I do think, based on what we saw, the longer term protocols in heifers, I think, work effectively. But the point that I would highlight is the fact that any of those indicus influenced heifers can be expected to reach puberty at older ages and heavier weights. So nutritional development of those heifers is going to be extremely important. But if you look at how those heifers perform that we're cycling in comparison to the Taurus heifers from our database here in Missouri, based on TRACT scores, those heifers are performing very comparably to the Taurus heifers here in Missouri, based on cycling status. So, you know, I think more work needs to be done in that area, but you know, I think it's at least encouraging that we're seeing the results that we saw down there with those longer protocols.
All right. I know we didn't even touch on this topic, and I'm not sure if we're planning on it throughout the rest of the webinar series that we do, the next two. But are there any suggested protocols for embryo transfer?
When you're talking about recipients female?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's been a fair bit of work done already with regard to using the 7-day co-sync plus cedar protocol, you know, to synchronize recips. Jordan Thomas here in our group at Mizzou actually has some large field trials underway right now. And the only thing that I can tell you is, because those prec checks are currently underway with the new protocol, that at this point, you know, the jury's out, but it's premature to, you know, to offer any information about that until we have the data. But, you know, that's a growing area of interest as well, just simply due to the fact we have more folks that are using their herds as recipients. And so I think that's another topic that you're going to see more work emerging from in the next several years.
Don't you think they've had some reasonable success though with the seven day, and right now that's a good choice
Yes.
for
Yes.
setting those
Yes.
cows up?
Yes, and that's probably been the protocol that's been used the most extensively.
All right. Well, unfortunately, everyone, we are right up against time. For those that still have questions that were not answered, I will forward those questions on to our presenters. They will have your email address and they can reach out to you. Again, I encourage attendees to register for the next webinar, The Cycle of Reproduction, with Dr. George Perry from South Dakota State University and Dr. Adam Summers from New Mexico State University. And I'd like to thank Dr. Patterson and Dr. Johnson for joining us tonight.
Glad to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, everyone have a great night.